Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Day the World Ended, The Mount Pelee Disaster, May 7th, 1902, by Gordon Thomas and Max Morgan Witz, narrated by Joe Barrett. Saint-Pierre, Martinique, May 8th, 1902. This date should be written in blood. Monsieur Gabriel Parel, Vicar General of Martinique. Author's Note: a number of accounts of May 8, 1902 have been written, mostly soon after the event, when it was not possible for the authors to benefit from the many sources of evidence we have been able to call upon. Inevitably, we have been confronted from time to time with conflicting evidence, as in the Guérin disaster, when some put the total dead as high as 400, as in the overall death roll, which has been reputed to be 50,000, or in the number of survivors in the town, which has fluctuated between none and 4. Where we had to make a choice of fact, we relied most heavily on the official reports of the Académie des Sciences, the Royal Society, and the American Museum of Natural History. Whenever there was a choice of interpretation, we relied on our own judgment. In these isolated instances, the decision was ours alone, and none of those who so generously helped us during our research should be thought to have automatically endorsed our portrayal of the events as we have described them. G.T. and M.M.W., London, 1968. Prologue. There had been a rumbling for 2 weeks. It was deep-throated and muted, coming as it did from the bowels of the earth. It had caused no panic in the town. The noise and the puffs of smoke that accompanied it were reported by the local newspaper as being of no more than passing interest. Even at the beginning of the 3rd week, when the night sky was lit by flashes of light that resembled artillery fire seen from a great distance, nobody in the town was unduly worried. The most positive reaction was from the man who sat down and wrote a letter to the London Times. He noted that the rumbling, the smoke, and the ash that it generated, and the light flashes, all seemed to be produced so normally that even those who were inclined to look on the dark side seemed to have nothing to fear. In that month of April there was indeed no one in the town who appeared frightened. The first day of May dawned to produce a lull in the rumbling and its attendant side effects. The townspeople smiled at each other. On the whole, they were convinced that they had been right in not fearing the happenings of the previous 23 days. Then late in the afternoon they saw that the mighty cone from which the puffs of smoke had been emitted was now presenting a new phenomenon. Vapor trails careened into the sky, crisscrossing each other to form intricate patterns. They produced interest, speculation, even excitement among the younger population, but again there was no recorded case of fear. The vapor trails were still visible that night when the town went to sleep. It was in the early hours of May 2nd, 1902, that they ceased. Shortly afterward the fallout came, swiftly and silently, to Saint-Pierre. The final agony of a town that some believed deserved to die had begun. Friday, May 2nd, 1902. Chapter 1. The First Victim. He was always punctual. Each morning when Fernand Claire rose from his brass bedstead, which, like the cotton nightshirt he wore, had been imported from France, and pushed open the stout shutters of his bedroom, the inhabitants of Saint-Pierre knew it was 6 o'clock. As he walked out on the balcony which ran around the house, the distant toll of the bell of the Cathedral of Saint-Pierre carried across the awakening city and up to the hillside where he stood. A remarkable sight greeted him. The entire town, the sea beyond, and the thick hinterland appeared to be coated with a heavy fall of hoarfrost, yet the sun was hot on his skin. Nearer at hand, inside the estate wall, on the branches of the lime trees, Claire noticed that the frost appeared to be like crude cement powder. Below him in the paved courtyard it lay thick and even. The powder completely hid the waxed floorboards of the balcony. Where it had been caught by the wind that blew all year over and around the island, the powder had drifted to form conical shapes that were not unlike volcanoes. Claire stooped down and pinched the tip of one of the mounds between finger and thumb, rose to his feet and carefully sniffed the powder. It had a bitter aroma about it that he instantly recognized. He had last sniffed it a month before. Then he had gone with his family to the L'étang des Palmistes, a lake in the crater basin of Mont Pelee, the island's largest volcano. They had gone together on a Sunday afternoon for a picnic by the lake. As they had sat there inside the rim basin of the volcano, watching the clear light casting giant shadows on the pumice rocks, Claire had noticed a wisp of smoke rising from a corner of the lake. With his 2 children, he had walked across the gritty pumice soil to investigate. As they approached, a breeze sent the wisp curling toward them. The smoke had made their eyes smart and stung the backs of their throats. Then, as they stood there, coughing and spitting, the water had bubbled, and a black jet had fountained into the air. It fell in a lazy arc across the branches of a tree overhanging the lake. They looked, smarting and rasping temporarily forgotten, at the now seared and withered branches. Without waiting to investigate further, Claire had hurried his family away from the crater. 3 weeks ago, alone this time, he had returned to the volcano. From a distance, Mont Pelee, the bald mountain, was the classical volcanic shape, a circular cone culminating in a single summit peak that sloped on 3 sides down to the sea. Closer, the bold strokes of nature's erosive carving were revealed in numerous canyons and gorges. To reach the crest, Claire had to pick his way over piles of pumice. The top resembled a truncated loaf surrounded by a circle of pointed hills. The highest, Mont de la Croix, stood about 200 feet above the lake. Claire picked his way up its slope to gain the maximum vantage point. For a man approaching middle age, he showed little sign of his exertions. He paused to gain his breath, and then looked down into the crater. For a long time he stood there, unable to believe his eyes. The placid surface of the lake was now a black mixture of bituminous appearance, bubbling and boiling, rising and puffing. From time to time, jets of white vapor and scalding water escaped, and then fell back brusquely into the cauldron. Mont Pelee, asleep for 51 years, was almost fully awake. He had hurried back to the estate, bathed to remove the smell of sulfur from his body, and then sat down in his study to write a report on what he had seen. He had sealed the report in an envelope and addressed it to the island's governor, Louis-Marius Moutet. He had summoned a houseboy and ordered him to go on horseback to Fort-de-France, 15 miles down the coast, deliver the report to the governor's office, and await a reply. When it came, it turned out to be no more than a polite formal acknowledgment with the writer that if the situation worsened, the governor should be informed. Claire had not been surprised by this lack of reaction on the part of the governor. For some time their relationship had been strained. Now, standing in the balcony 3 weeks after the governor's reply, and sniffing the sulfur ash that during the night had been ejected by Pelee's crater, Claire realized that the situation had definitely worsened. He turned and looked away up the steep slopes to where Pelee's cone brooded in the still morning. Nothing disturbed the air around the crater, but the slopes were shrouded in ash that at a distance of 2 miles looked like icing on some giant Christmas tree decoration. Claire shook his head. Then he continued with the ritual he had followed every morning since he had moved his family from the town to this hillside home a mile outside of Saint-Pierre. For the past 10 years, every morning, including Sundays, he had arisen before his family and walked onto this balcony to look down on the town whose foundations generations of Claires had helped to strengthen. Claire had been among the first shipload of French who had settled the island of Martinique in 1635. The island is part of a group known as the Lesser Antilles, stretching, like piers of a bridge across the Seine, wrote an early settler, across the entrance to the Caribbean Sea. In the shape of an arc bowed out toward the Atlantic Ocean, they extend for 450 miles from the Anegada Passage near the Virgin Islands southward, almost to the coast of South America. The northern part of the group are called the Leeward Islands. The southern half are called the Windward Islands. All of them are the result of volcanic eruptions forcing the ocean bed up 10,000 or more feet. From prehistoric times, this string of islands has stretched across the throat of the Caribbean like a chain of smoldering furnaces about to burst into flame. Those first settlers had come ashore at a great bay that had been named Fort-de-France, a name that had a comforting, secure ring about it to those 17th-century men, women, and children who had sailed halfway across the world to find a new home. Fort-de-France had become the island's political capital. Later, when Saint-Pierre had been built, the commercial center of the island had found its home in the new town. The settlers could not have known it, but they had chosen to settle on an island that was a dormant time bomb. The fuse was buried deep inside Mount Pelee, named by the colonists after the Hawaiian goddess of volcanoes, Pelee. But only twice in 300 years had the time bomb started to tick. Once in 1792, it had spluttered a thin scattering of ash over the crater's immediate slopes. In 1851, the volcano had erupted after a week of rumbling, throwing out a column of ash which had drifted down to coat Saint-Pierre in a mantle of white. The eruption had lasted only a short time. It was followed by a severe rainstorm that washed all the ash away. Few had been frightened. Now, on this quiet morning of Friday, May 2nd, 1902, Claire saw that this night's fall of sulphuric ash also appeared to have caused little concern in the town. He could make out a few early risers standing in the streets, looking toward the silent cone of Mount Pelee, towering 2 miles inland. From his vantage point, Claire observed no panic. Probably the townspeople had lived with a volcano for so long that they had long ceased to look upon it as a threat, he mused, and understandably so, for the town had been built on a beach at the base of a great natural amphitheater of rocks which rose to end at the summit of Mount Pelee. Saint-Pierre had become the island's social as well as commercial center. It was known as far away as Puerto Rico in the north and Trinidad in the south as the Paris of the West Indies. It strove hard to live up to its reputation, importing cabaret acts from Paris, fleecing the sailors in the waterfront bordellos, and living at a pace that Staid Fort-de-France thought positively indecent. Claire himself, a devout family man, had little time for the nightlife of the town. One of the reasons he had moved out from its precincts was to escape from the late-night carousing. Another reason was that he felt it more in keeping with his standing in the community to live apart from it, to view it, as he did every morning, from a distance. His vantage point enabled him to feel both dispassionate and paternal toward the city below. This morning, even with its shroud of ash, Saint-Pierre offered Claire a view he could take much pride in. From his eyrie he had a clear view of the rum distilleries and furniture factories that were the spine of the island's economic framework, a spine whose very nerve ends he controlled. He was the largest planter on the island, a millionaire, undisputed commercial overlord of the island's population of 189,500. Next to Governor Moutet, Claire was the accepted social leader of the French-born colony who effectively administered the island for France. Most of them worked and lived in the streets leading off the Rue Victor Hugo, the town's main street, which ran in a gentle crescent along the seafront. Bisecting it was a series of shorter streets leading back from the waterfront and petering out against the slopes of the sharply rising amphitheater of rock. The cathedral, the military hospital, the town hall, and the island's 2 leading banks, the Bank of Martinique and the English Colonial Bank, were all clustered on the Rue Victor Hugo. But for the most part the town consisted of 2- and 3-story buildings made of stone with red tile roofs. Many of these were clustered along the side of the Roxelane, a river that ran through the town and emptied itself into the sea. Except in the rainy season, it was little more than a sluggish stream. When the rains came, it became a raging torrent, swirling fish and debris from the hinterland out to sea. The bulk of the town's middle-class Creole population lived beside it. Below the Roxelane was the harbor, a natural curving basin through which the entire commercial, financial, and social life of the island funneled itself. That morning Claire counted 8 ships anchored in the roadstead. 5 flew the American flag. They brought from the United States the supplies essential to the island's survival. The ships' holds were filled with flour, dried vegetables, salted and smoked meats, and leaf tobacco, as well as crates containing clothes, clocks, oil lamps, and sewing machines. The other 3 ships flew the British flag. Their holds were empty, waiting to be filled with the island's raw materials, sugar, rum, cocoa, and coffee, waiting to be filled with the produce of Claire's estates that dotted the island's 380 square miles, estates that helped guarantee Martinique's economic standing in the world. Particularly dependent on that economic standing were the bulk of Saint-Pierre's population of 26,011 men, women, and children who lived downtown, away from the houses of the French-born colons. They were the propriétaires vivriers, smallholders, varicolored from a century and more of breeding with the sailors of the world who came to the island. Healthy exports meant a regular supply of ships calling at Martinique. Ships meant customers in one form or another for the propriétaire vivrier. Few of them had as much as spoken to the man who lived on the hillside outside the town, but all knew their debt to his enterprise. As the bell of the Cathedral of Saint-Pierre ceased its tolling, Claire reached for a telescope standing in a rack on the balcony. Adjusting the eyepiece, he brought into sharp focus a section of the area where the smallholders lived. Each holding appeared to be the same: a tin-roofed house surrounded by trees bearing ripening avocados, mangoes, star apples, oranges, limes, and grapefruit. Studded between the trees were tufts of sugarcane, breadfruit plants, and tunnels of bamboo that sheltered root vegetables from the midday sun. Tethered around the tunnels were goats, cows, and small Creole horses. Like the rest of the town, the mulatto quarter appeared calm under its coat of ashes. Claire lowered his telescope and walked to a corner of the balcony. This was a new departure in his morning routine. It was one that he had started after returning from his second visit to the crater. The day after he had returned, he had secured a barometer to one of the supporting pillars of the balcony. Now, as he had done every day since then, he carefully studied the needle. It was twitching a little more than it had done the previous morning when he had inspected it. He turned again and looked up toward the mountain crater. As he did so, there was a deafening crash, like a broadside of cannon, he was to remember, and a fresh column of ash shot into the sky. Claire watched it soar heavenward. Then, caught by the wind, it started to dissipate, spreading across the sky and blotting out the sun. In a minute the ash was falling silently on Saint-Pierre. Mount Pelee, 50 miles square at its base, had stirred a stage further, emitting yet another warning. Claire turned at a noise close behind him. It was his wife, Veronique. She padded out to the balcony in her nightdress. In her hand she held a crucifix. The statue of Christ on the cross had been carved from a piece of pumice stone taken from an upper slope of the volcano. Together the Claires knelt and prayed on the balcony. 51 years before to the day, the last time Mont Pelee had awakened, Fernand Clerc's grandfather had also prayed. Then the volcano's activity had been short-lived, and there were many on the island who said this was due to the intervention of God in answer to the prayers of Jean-Marc Claire. Now his grandson and wife prayed for similar intervention. Sitting on the doorstep of his house in the Mouillage quarter of the town, on the quayside that ran along the entire waterfront, Léon Compère Léandre watched the ash falling on the 3 British ships riding at anchor in the roadstead. The air reeked of sulphur, bringing tears to his eyes and a dry, retching feeling in his throat. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and tied it over his nose and mouth. It offered a little relief against the acrid fallout. Léon, aged 28, was a shoemaker. He was descended from one of the penal laborers who had originally been transported from France to carry out heavy manual work on the island. Intermarriage with Creole and Negro factions of the island's population in previous generations had now given Léon's skin a light coffee pigmentation. At a distance he could pass for a colon, a useful asset when it came to drinking in the waterfront taverns, where tempers often ran high, and the descendant of a convict was still regarded as byplay for practicing knife-fighting by many of the sailors. Intermarriage, though, had done little to remove the basic superstitions that had been handed down to him from his father and from his father's father, superstitions that still ruled his life. They included a belief in the devil and that Mont Pelee was an air vent through which the devil could breathe fumes from hell. Now, as the ash settled everywhere, carpeting everything in sight a dull grayish white, Léon was convinced that evil was afoot. He also felt, this time instinctively, that he would not be safe in his waterfront home. He decided instead to seek shelter in his basement cobbler's shop in the town's main square, Place Bertin. Holding his handkerchief over his mouth and using the other hand to wipe the tears from his eyes, he set off for his shelter. From sea level, Saint-Pierre appeared to back onto the very edge of the southern foot of Mont Pelee, rising in tiers from the open roadstead which formed its harbor. At this level, too, the streets seemed much narrower than they had appeared from Claire's vantage point. The houses, all stone-built and stone-flagged, crowded in on each other, each with its wooden or zinc awning casting a permanent shadow over the cobbles. Léon's sandaled feet made no sound as they scuffed over the ash. The only sound was that of running water pouring through the deep gutters of the twisting, climbing streets. This morning the water, usually clear, was stained and sluggish. The ash had already started its corrosive course of discoloration and clogging. As he approached the Place Bertin, Léon had still seen no one. Pierre, it seemed to him, through either choice, force of habit, or unawareness, had decided to ignore the falling ash. Just short of the entrance to the main square, Léon came upon a young horse tethered to a wall ring of a house. Like all the other dwellings in the street, the shutters of this house were tightly closed beneath the traditional gable dormers. As he approached, the horse, already well coated with ash, started to snort and pant in pain. Suddenly it buckled at the knees, making a dreadful choking sound as it did so. It rolled its eyes in terror, struggled to regain its footing, found it was too far gone for the effort, and slumped down on its side. Léon stooped beside it. One of the other superstitions that governed his life was a belief that being kind to animals would ensure him a place in heaven. He looked around for some means of giving the horse practical assistance. Nearby, at the entrance to the Place Bertin, was a water trough with a tin bucket attached to it by a slim chain. The bucket and trough were used to replenish water supplies for caravans of mules that journeyed into the hinterland. Léon tugged at the chain, exerting pressure and sharp pulls. The chain snapped, freeing the bucket. He dipped the bucket into the trough, pushing it below the film of ash coating the surface. Then, slopping water as he ran, he returned to the fallen horse. Cradling the animal's head, he trickled water over its mouth and nose. He had wasted his strength. The horse was dead, suffocated by the falling ash. Mount Pelee had claimed its first victim. Chapter 2. The Anxious Bridegroom. Fernand and Véronique Claire were not alone in seeking solace and comfort in prayer that morning. In various parts of the town, a number of people had risen early for morning mass in the cathedral. On Thursday, a week away, it would be the holy day of the Ascension, when people would travel from all over the island to celebrate the feast, both in the precincts of the cathedral and later in the taverns and dining rooms of the town. Among the early risers that morning was Mrs. Clara Prentice, the wife of the American consul. In her elegant home near the town's botanical gardens, she dressed carefully, mindful of her position as the wife of a senior foreign diplomat on the island. Putting on her lace-trimmed bonnet and white silk gloves, she stepped briskly out into the street. As she did so, a distant fresh rumble came from the crater of Mont Pelee. She paused, wondering what was to follow. She had not long to wait. A column of white billowed up from the cone, and shortly afterward the ashfall descended on her part of the town. It fell thicker and faster than it had done before. Mrs. Prentice stood quite still, watching the ash settle around and on her. In a minute her clothes were ruined, irrevocably stained by the substance. As she stood there, she was dimly aware of several people running past. The ash deadened their footfalls. The only sound they made was a hoarse panting as the lava ash caught in their throats. Across the street a small bundle fell from the roof of a house. It writhed on the pavement, scuffing and slithering on the cobbles. Clara Prentice walked across the road and saw that it was a bird. Weighed down by the ashfall, its wings had been unable to lift it from its rooftop nest, and it had plummeted to the pavement. She picked it up and started to dust the ash off its wings and body. As she did so, a man stopped beside her. "I wouldn't waste your sentiment on a bird, madame," he said. Before she could reply, he had taken the bird from her hands and tossed it over a nearby wall. Without another word, he turned and ran off into the ash storm. She stood there for a moment, the ash bringing tears to her eyes. Then she turned and walked rapidly back to her home, pulling off her hat and gloves as she entered. She walked briskly up to her husband's bedroom, pausing outside to look behind her. She had left a trail of ash footprints across the hall and up the stairs. She pulled open the bedroom door. Her husband Thomas was still in bed, reading the town's leading newspaper, Les Colonies. He put it aside as his wife entered. Without pausing in her stride, Clara Prentice walked to the shutters and forced them open. A flurry of ash entered the bedroom. She pulled the shutters closed and walked to the foot of the bed and faced her husband. "It will erupt soon," she said. "It must." For a little while there was silence in the room. Then Thomas Prentice rose slowly from his bed, a portly, soft-muscled man, and walked to the shutters. He pushed them open and looked out at the steadily falling ash. Soon he was coughing from the tang of sulphur. Only then did he appear satisfied at what he saw. He drew the shutters closed. "I must arrange for you and the children to leave here as soon as possible," he said. "I am not going without you." Clara Prentice was a determined woman. On May 10th, the family would celebrate their 4th anniversary on the island, though her husband had not been appointed American consul to Martinique until April 3, 1901. To mark the occasion, she was planning a quiet family dinner party for him and 2 of their children, Christine and Louise. Her 2 sons would not be able to attend. Her eldest child, James, lived in Chicago. Thomas, second in succession to the modest Prentice fortune, lived in Batavia. Apart from the coming dinner party, Clara Prentice believed that in her role as a diplomat's wife, it would be unthinkable for her to leave her husband's side at a time of impending crisis. It was a similar sense of position that had stopped her going on to morning mass. In her eyes it would have been almost a mortal sin for the wife of the American consul to appear before the cathedral's worshippers as if she had been dragged through a cinder bath. Suzette Laveniere, aged 24, was preparing breakfast when she heard the new rumbling. It was deeper and louder than ever before. She put down the coffee pot and hurried out of the kitchen to investigate. Outside in the villa's courtyard, a number of workmen on her father's estate were grouped, talking excitedly among themselves and pointing across the valley to the summit of Mount Pelee 7 miles away. They fell silent at the appearance of Suzette. Her father owned one of the island's 1,150 sugarcane plantations. The Laveniere estate was a large rectangle of land 4 miles to the south of Saint-Pierre. The estate, rising from the floor to halfway up the side of a valley, looked across to the town and the volcano towering above it. Like many other members of the land-owning ruling class of Martinique, the Lavenieres ran their estate with a firm but tolerant hand. The 100 native families who worked the crop were well-housed, adequately clothed, and fairly paid. They lived at a decent distance beside the villa Suzette occupied with her father, a widower. That morning Pierre Laveniere had risen early to inspect the furthest outpost of the estate, about a mile from the villa, at the bottom of the valley. He had taken his foreman and 6 hands with him. They had gone to investigate a report that the ash fallout had blighted the young crop and that the stream, which bordered the estate on 3 sides, had risen sharply in the last 24 hours. Flooding was nothing new. Every year during the 5 months' rainy season, the stream breached its shallow banks. But the rainy season was over, and the stream had reverted to little more than a sluggish trickle. As he set off, Laveniere had turned to his daughter and murmured, "It could be the mountain. The stream begins near the summit." Then, an hour before, the summit had been peaceful. Now, as she stood in the courtyard, the very ground beneath her seemed to shake from the rumbling. A tongue of flame, orange-brown, forked out of the cone, and then was seemingly sucked back into the volcano. Years of self-dependence had taught Suzette Laveniere to stay calm, no matter what the situation. "It is not as bad as it was earlier this morning. There's no ash falling," she said firmly. "But what about the flames?" protested a native. "There's no need to worry," repeated Suzette. "All the same, I will go and fetch my father. In the meantime, go about your work like any other day." The words, delivered with assurance, appeared to satisfy the natives. They drifted away to their various tasks. As they did so, the rumbling and fire from the mouth of Pelee died away. A total silence appeared to settle over the countryside. Without knowing why, Suzette feared the silence more than the noise. Forgetting that she had not finished her breakfast preparations, she walked to the stable, mounted a horse, and set off to find her father. She started to sing, in much the way that, as a child, she had sung to keep up her courage in the dark. Suzette had ridden for only a little time before she became aware of a dull roar ahead. She kicked her horse into a canter and hurried through the cane. Shortly afterward she heard the shouting, also coming from ahead, from the direction of the stream. Suddenly, through a break in the cane, she saw a sight that stunned her. The quiet, sluggish stream had vanished. In its place, a sea of boiling mud was racing down the far slopes of the valley and spreading across the valley floor like a thick glue. Firmly trapped in the filth were her father and his men. Already the mud had reached the haunches of their horses, They had been on the far side of the valley when the avalanche had poured down on them. Struggling to get clear, they had stood no chance against this tidal wave of mud. All they could do now was cry pitifully.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?